Welcome, comrades, to the Spectre of Communism podcast, teamed up with the Against the Stream podcast for the final episode of the season for both shows. What a year it's been.
A spectre is haunting Europe. The spectre of communism.
Communism is stronger, more determined than ever.
Communism.
The communists.
The communists.
The communists.
Dedicated to the establishment of a new order.
2024, we've seen revolution, we've seen war, we've seen counter-revolution. Literally within the last couple of weeks, you've seen the fall of the Assad regime in Syria. A gunman went viral after shooting dead a healthcare insurance CEO in New York. And if there's one thing that this year has shown, it's that the crisis of capitalism on the world stage has reached an unprecedented level, and it's expressing itself in a general decay of all pillars of the establishment and a rise of class anger. We're going to do a bit of a roundup of the year, and I'm very happy to bring in the host of our sister show Against the Stream, Hamid Alizadeh, from the International Secretariat of the Revolutionary Communist International. Hamid, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Joe.
And also from the International Secretariat, and a regular guest on both Spectre of Communism and Against the Stream, we have Jorge Martin. Jorge, it's great to have you as well.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So we're actually sitting down to record this on the 10th of December, and such is the speed of events that almost certainly this analysis will be totally out of date by the time it actually gets to you. But that in of itself is quite instructive about the state of the world we're living in. I'm going to go more or less chronologically through the events that dominated the year, and I think it's fair to say that the Gaza war, it started, of course, in its current phase on the 7th of October of last year, but it's cast the longest shadow of all of the major events we've seen in 2024. So, Jorge, what do we say as communists, as Marxists, about the state of play in Gaza? The events, but also what does this signify? What does this show about the state of world politics and the horrors that capitalism creates?
Yeah, well, the first thing to say is that what we've seen in Gaza over the last year, 14 months, is really a genocide. There's no doubt about that. According to official figures by the health ministry in Gaza, I think it's now 44,000, coming to 45,000 people have been killed. But these figures are a big underestimation of the real figure, the number of people killed. Plus, on top of this, you have hundreds of thousands, possibly 1.5 million people displaced. People have been moved from one part of the Gaza Strip to another, to areas that they were told were safe by the Israeli Defense Force, only to then be bombed. I was looking this morning, there was a bombing yesterday, an airstrike against a line of Palestinians in Gaza that were waiting for flour distribution. 50 people were killed. And this is no longer makes the news because this has become a constant occurrence. And this is a complete scandal. According to the United Nations, there was another recent report of the United Nations that said that 70% of the people killed in Gaza that they have been able to analyze over a certain period of time, 70% of the people were killed were women and children. This is nothing to do. This is not a war. This is a genocide. This is a genocidal campaign on the part of Israel. This is the first thing to say. And this has now become normalized. And all the major Western powers, Britain, Germany, France, the United States above all, they justify this. They say that this is Israel's right to defend itself. Not only they justify it, which is scandalous enough, they actually provide the weapons and the funding for it. So this is a complete outrage, and it's been going on for over a year. But this is not the only thing that's been happening in this campaign by Israel. On top of this, they've carried out a massacre in the West Bank, which is not even allegedly involved in this. I mean, Hamas didn't attack Israel from the West Bank, but there's been constant killings, the invasion of refugee camps, and so on in the West Bank. On top of this, then Israel has also bombed Syria repeatedly over 1 year. It's bombed Iran. The bombing of Syria was in breach of all international right. They bombed the Iranian embassy. This is Iranian territory in Syria, in a third country. They also unprovoked. Then they bombed Iran to kill one of the leaders of the so-called axis of resistance. And then they invaded Lebanon. On top of all this, they invaded Lebanon. They bombed Yemen. So, I mean, this is, I think that one of the things that comes out of this most strikingly is the fact that international law, international right, it's all a farce, isn't it? There are certain things that are supposed to be against international law. They are condemned by the world's powers, but only if our enemies carry them out. If it's our friends, in this case Israeli imperialism, then it's all right. Then it becomes the right of self-defense.
Or even where institutions like the International Court of Justice, for example, do condemn Israel, and we've seen arrest warrants brought against Benjamin Netanyahu and also Yoav Gallant. It's shown to be completely impotent, because ultimately the so-called rules-based order means what? It means the right of the most powerful imperialist nations to rule as they wish, more or less, and to impose their authority and to impose their interests.
And I think that's one of the things that's got people most angry about these events. The impunity with which this massacre has been carried out, and the full support by all Western powers, by Western imperialism. In fact, we have to say that you just mentioned the arrest warrants, but in reality, Biden, Sunak, Starmer, Scholz, and Macron are as responsible as Netanyahu himself, because none of this could have been carried out without the full backing, support, funding, supplies of ammunition, weapons, and so on by the Western powers, particularly U.S. imperialism.
I remember you saying on Against the Stream, I can't remember who you were quoting, but there was some guy who said, look, the ICJ, it's supposed to be for dictators in Africa, not for the leaders of democratic countries like Israel. Washington Post editorial, there we are. And the role of the press also in the West, it's been absolutely disgusting in terms of providing cover for what Israel's doing, for attacking the people, pointing out these horrendous war crimes, this genocide, as anti-Semites. And one of the most inspiring responses to this terrible series of atrocities was the big wave of student occupations that broke out in the spring. You had students starting in America, but spreading ultimately all over the world, occupying their campuses and demanding that their universities withdraw their funding from Israeli institutions. And it was a very courageous campaign. Ultimately, it was driven to defeat. But there was a huge amount of repression by campus authorities, but also the actual state authorities. State troopers were brought in some instances with tear gas and tasers to deal with these peacefully protesting students, but also this hair-raising slander campaign in the press. Comrades of our own were slandered, were arrested, were labeled terrorists by the police, by the press. Absolutely disgusting.
Yeah, because in bourgeois democracy, you can say whatever you want and you can protest unless and until you actually are hurting or dealing with the fundamental interests of imperialism. And then that's when your freedoms finish. As you said, comrades of ours in at least two countries, in Germany and Austria, have been investigated on the basis of threat to national security for the defense of Palestinian rights. In Britain, comrades have been arrested, detained, been called by the police. Wanted Twitter ads have been issued against them. For what crime? For saying intifada until victory, for defending the Palestinian rights at perfectly legal demonstrations. The aim is to cow and to threaten the solidarity movement, so that people are too afraid to protest.
I think also this shows that there's a parallel process here. You can say one thing is the actual war on Gaza and on the Palestinian people, on Lebanon and so on, which has its own logic, which has its own dynamic, so to say. but this has now become a catalyst for the development of class consciousness all over the world, in the sense that it's bringing out all of everything that people have actually suspected for many years. They can see the rot, they can see the narrow-mindedness, the greed, the hypocrisy of the ruling class. And this war has just, before that there was maybe a case of plausible deniability. There was always a way that the ruling class could cover over it. They could use their propaganda machines. They could use, all of the different tools at their disposal in the education system, the media, and so on and so forth. But now, here you have this blood-soaked regime, fully supported by all of the Western governments, who claim to be the standard bearers of democracy and human rights. We, the West, are above the rest of the world because of these values. And yet, they support this. Not only do they do that, but when people go out and exercise their so-called democratic rights and fight for human rights and what is portrayed as Western values, they're repressed, they're persecuted, and that means that the whole edifice of bourgeois ideology is cracking up in a way. And I mean, we can discuss this later on.
And there's an additional factor, I will say, the fact that this onslaught on Gaza is taking place so close in time with the Ukraine war.
Yes.
That the contrast between the two things. I remember there was a walkout here in Tower Hamlets of school students against the attack on the Palestinians. And one young school student was saying, look, when the war in Ukraine started, the school officially organized something. We had an assembly about that. And there were Ukraine flags everywhere, and this is an outrageous invasion by a foreign power and Russian aggression and war crimes. And now then, when we want to talk about Palestine, we are shut down.
Yes.
And people are not allowed to talk about Palestine because that will, I don't know, somehow create anti-Semitism or whatever excuse they can find.
Exactly. I mean, the hypocrisy around Ukraine is just insane, because all of the things that they were accusing Putin for, Netanyahu is doing much more blatantly.
Tenfold.
Yeah. And there's full defense. Anyone who attacks him, in fact, is being victimized, is being persecuted. Netanyahu attacks Iran, attacks Lebanon. What is the first? Invades southern Lebanon, invades Gaza.
It seized a buffer zone, as he calls it, in Syria.
Oh yes, as we speak, Israel is expanding its buffer zone for its buffer zone. There was a buffer zone before, which is Golan Heights. Now they're creating a buffer zone for that.
What you might call an annexation.
Clearly expanding into Syria. And but anyone who speaks against, what is the response of the West when, for example, when the Israelis bombed Iran?
Iran must show restraint.
Iran is provoking.
Yes.
That's the rules-based order. You take the hits that we give you. You take the dictates that the West gives you. Otherwise, you breaking the law, breaking the rules.
Yeah, the rules-based order is we make the rules.
Exactly.
In fact, David Lammy just said that Israel bombing everywhere in Syria and invading territory of Syria. Never mind the fact that the Golan Heights is occupied territory according to international law, but now it's expanding. That this is because Israel has genuine national security concerns. So it's not an invasion, it's justified.
Yeah.
Well, we're gravitating towards the other conflict, which has dominated perspectives for the last couple of years, the war in Ukraine. So we've released a number of articles and we've had a few discussions on this podcast and on Against the Stream about the phase that war is in. But I think that we should give a little bit of a balance sheet, admittedly telegraphic, because we've only got, one episode to deal with a few different things this year. But Hamid, the Ukraine war, catch us all up. Why did it begin? What are the interests behind this conflict? And what state is it in now?
Well, we are told, obviously, that this was an unprovoked invasion by Russia. That's the line. Unprovoked invasion, unprovoked invasion. The fact is that most analysts, even in the West, would admit that Russia for decades has been saying NATO Ukraine is unacceptable for Russia. What does it mean? It means placing a hostile army with missile defense, missile systems and arms and so on and so forth in a country which is culturally and economically and geographically completely enmeshed in Russia. There's no, the borders are porous in every way you can imagine. And that would mean a direct threat to Russia itself. In fact, it would only be that. It would be a springboard for an offensive, whether it be political, economic, or military, into Russia. And so the Russians have always said they wouldn't accept this. Now, when Zelensky was elected, actually, I was just reading, there's an article in The Spectator called The Deepening Unpopularity of Zelensky. And it explains how unpopular he's become. He's only got 22% support at the moment. 60% of people don't even think he should stand for elections.
He was elected on a peace with Russia
Exactly.
platform.
He was elected on the basis of what? Against the oligarchs, against the people who were ruling, the rulers of Ukraine, and against a confrontatory policy towards Russia.
Yeah, I remember he went on TV and he said, look, people in the East, if they want to speak Russian, let them speak Russian.
Yes.
We don't want to enter into a hot war.
Exactly.
We need to normalize relations.
Exactly. The Americans thought the Americans actually, Joe Biden and his administration, for their own reasons, provoked this war. They didn't give the guarantee. Russia wanted guarantees that Ukraine would not enter NATO. The Americans actually knew that they're not planning on admitting Ukraine to NATO, but they will not sign that piece of paper either, which means provoking Russia, putting up, how do you say, actually crossing the red line, so to say, that they so don't exist, crossing Russia's red line and provoking it into attacking Ukraine. And then, even in the first months of the fight, it was clear that in the beginning, Russia obviously overestimated its own power, underestimated Ukraine, underestimated the amount that NATO had actually integrated into Ukraine and developed the Ukrainian army and so on.
Because it really, in all intents and purposes, it was a NATO army that Russia was facing, right, in terms of its equipment, in terms of its...
To a certain extent, to a relatively high extent it was, 25,000 NATO-educated officers and so on. However, by March 2022, there was already peace negotiations in place in Istanbul. There was a peace deal on the table that was agreed on by both sides. And what happened was that the West, with the Western puppet, the US puppet, Boris Johnson, went down to Kiev and forbade them, told them, do not sign this deal, and we're going to back you to the hilt.
Yeah, Johnson, for quite narrow reasons as well. He was thinking about his own career in Britain when he was doing that, but obviously would have had the support of the Americans to take that step.
And he said, we're gonna back you regardless. However, at that point already, it was clear that this war was not going to be won by the West. And therefore, this was the cynical idea that somehow dragging Russia into a quagmire, somehow using this to sap Russia's energy resources and resources generally, and thereby being able to weaken it for the Americans and the West to be able to focus on Russia. However, I brought something which I think is quite...
Not only this. Yeah. In fact, at one point, Biden said, this war cannot end without regime change in Moscow.
Precisely. That was clear. Lots of them. These were some of the ideas. Some of them were talking about decolonizing Russia, i.e. splitting Russia up into many, many different parts. Lots of very, very reactionary ideas. The idea was to push Russia back into a subservient position like it was in the 90s. That was the plan. To create the position where the US could once more become a dominating element inside of Russia, rather than Russia being a world or a world power essentially. Now, I brought something because I brought a quote because we had an article. Alan Woods, the main theoretician of the RCI, wrote an article in April 2022, which I think is quite telling because at the time there was lots of talk about Russia not having missiles, Russia being a disorganized army. Using shovels. Actually, they do use shovels, but those are special shovels that the special forces...
Special combat shovels.
They are, yeah, and it's quite interesting, actually. Anyway, but here's what Alan writes. He says, Ever since the start of the war, the massive propaganda machine that the Ukrainians have put in motion with the help of US intelligence has been repeating with monotonous regularity the same tiresome litany. The Russian advance has stalled. They have so far not been able to capture and hold any large Ukrainian city. That was what they were saying back then. And they've been keep saying it until fairly recently. But then he continues a bit further down. He says, however, Clausewitz, the great Hegelian theoretician of war, said that the aim of the war is not the conquest of territory and cities, but the destruction of the enemy forces. And Alan goes on to quote, fighting is, quote Clausewitz, fighting is the central military act. Engagement means fighting. The object of fighting is the destruction of the, or defeat of the enemy. What do we mean by defeat of the enemy? Simply the destruction of his forces, whether by death, injury, or any other means, either completely or enough to make him stop fighting. The complete or partial destruction of the enemy must be regarded as the sole object of all engagements, and direct annihilation of the enemy's forces must always be the dominant consideration. Now, the talk has always been, there's war going on, but Russia is not really advancing. The advances is not very rapid and very great. And that is a fact. It's also a fact that Ukraine had a much stronger army than the Russians accepted. But what Alan explains here, and what he explained also in other places in speeches and so on, is in general terms, in war, first of all, you can never know. There's no guarantee of predicting the end of a war because lots of things can happen. However, in general, once you get past the initial shock and awe that can send things off in motion, and if there's no talk about a political weakness that leads to collapse like we've seen in Syria, the defining element of the thing that's going to define a war is the size of the population and the industrial base. That's in the final analysis, that's what it's going to come down to. And that's what we see in Russia, is that Russia has a 3 times larger population than Ukraine. In fact, a huge part of 10 million people have left Ukraine. And we see that Ukraine is now having problems with manpower, whereas Russia is gradually, steadily expanding its manpower base. Ukrainians can't find enough soldiers to fight. The Russians are expanding. The Russians have expanded the military industry. They're outproducing the West in shells by several times. They're outproducing in missiles, in tanks, in all of these things. And the West cannot raise production anywhere near to what's necessary to put up a fight.
In fact, there are stockpiles of weapons in the West, in NATO countries, and now at minimal levels.
And what does that mean? From a Russian point of view, the war, and there is a reason why I'm saying this, from a Russian point of view, the war is a mathematical calculation. How many people can we kill of the other side, and how many of our own can we save? How can we make sure this disparity is to our favor the most? And that's the speed that they've been developing. Using heavy artillery, bombings, and gradually grinding down the Ukrainian army. Now that, at a certain point, reaches a qualitative leap, right? And we've been getting closer and closer to that point. We saw, in the early part of this year, we saw the fall of Avdiivka, which was one of the most heavily fortified areas in the world, which makes it very difficult to take. Since then, the whole of the 1914 defense line, which again, insanely well fortified. 2014. Defense line, insanely has all fallen. And each one of these cities and towns that fall, it means the level of attrition, i.e. the deaths on the Ukrainian side, gets more. And the deaths on the Russian side, on the other hand, gets less. And gradually, there's been grinding down, and now that's beginning to be felt in the morale of the army. There's a complete collapse of morale in the army, in the back. People don't want to go and fight. They can't find people to recruit. People don't want to go to the army because they know it's a one-way ticket.
People are leaving the front.
200,000 people have gone AWOL. What does this mean? This means that disparity in population and industrials is beginning to make itself felt. And at a certain point, this will have to resolve itself.
Yeah, and the inevitable unfolding of that attritional war that favors the Russians, it also explains some of the desperate moves that Zelensky's made, because it's clear from his point of view, he can't outlast the Russians, so he needs, from his perspective, to get NATO more directly involved, which explains this attempt to provoke Russia further, push more red lines.
All the red lines.
The Storm Shadows, the ATACMS, the long-range missiles that have now been given the green lights by the West, by the Americans, by the British, by the French.
Completely insane. Completely
for
irresponsible.
the Ukrainians to fire deep into Russian territory, threatening a direct confrontation with a nuclear power.
Precisely. The Zelensky is a desperate man. And some of the people of the West are desperate, because what does the defeat in the West, in Ukraine, signify? It's going to be a major defeat. First of all, for someone like Biden and his legacy and his whole team, the whole section of the establishment that he represents, it's going to be a defeat for U.S. imperialism and Western imperialism, because it also it heralds a new age in a way. And the reason why I raise this question of the industry is important, because you see, in the collapse, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, America remained as the sole superpower on the planet. American industry, American army, everything was far ahead of everyone else, and with Europe as this little puppet. What's happened since then is that Russia has rebuilt. That's what we can see. Russia has rebuilt its industry, and in particular its armed forces. And that army, that capacity is now being honed, is kind of now being realized through the Ukrainian struggle. It's a dialectical thing in a way. It's being realized through the struggle in Ukraine. And this is where we can see the balance of forces, that there's a shift in world politics. And it doesn't mean that Russia is as strong as the West, but it means that Russia is now a significant force, and the war in Ukraine has strengthened it in the way that it now has an army of almost 1 million people, battle-hardened, had the tactics, their strategies, their equipment tested in war against NATO.
Tested in modern warfare.
In modern warfare against, not like the Americans who've fought Afghanistan and
bombing
Iraq.
ragtag insurgents armed with AK-47s.
So after this war, there's going to be a new period. And this war is defining that period.
Can I say maybe there's another thing that's worth saying about the war in Ukraine at this point is that Western US-led sanctions on Russia have completely failed. And in fact, they have had the opposite effect of pushing a whole series of countries, including some that are supposed to be allies of the United States, into the opposite camp. You see countries like India, which has a military alliance with the United States, Russia, Turkey, which is a NATO country, helping Russia circumvent these sanctions. And the sanctions obviously have had some impact, but they haven't been able to diminish or weaken the Russian economy to the point where it cannot pursue this war anymore. And if anything, the sanctions have had the effect of Europe shooting itself in the foot. Europe has been the main party injured by these sanctions, by losing access to cheap energy sources which they used to get from Russia.
And now we see the result: the collapse of German industry. It's mind-boggling. Collapse of French industry. Those are the industrial hearts of Europe. What's that going to lead to for the rest? What's it going to mean for the rest of the region? It's just.
Well, it really shows the short-sighted idiocy of the representatives of European capitalism. They just sacrificed all of their economic and political interests on the altar of American imperialism, a war that didn't benefit them in the least. On the contrary. There's much more we could say about Ukraine, and we've produced a huge amount of material on Marxist.com, some of it written by Hamid and by Jorge. So I'll put links in the episode description so you can get a bit more detail. But I want to move on to what has historically often been the other side of the coin in a period of war. You also tend to have revolutions because, and Marie explained this on last week's episode, the tensions that produce war are also the tensions that produce revolution, and one can feed into the other. And this summer, you saw two major revolutionary movements in Kenya and also in Bangladesh. In previous years, we've seen revolutionary movements break out in Sri Lanka, before that also in Iran. A number of big protest and trade union movements and insurrectionary movements throughout the developed countries as well. But Jorge, I wondered if you could talk a little bit about these two concurrent revolutionary movements this summer and what they show us.
I think there are important points to be made about this. First of all, in June, in Kenya, we saw events that can only be described as insurrectionary. The government of Ruto wanted to introduce a finance bill, a budget, which basically amounted to making the working class and the poor pay so that the government will have enough money to pay for the foreign debt, servicing the foreign debt, which is a common thing for many countries, not only the so-called third world countries, but also advanced capitalist countries, the accumulation of state debt, massive spending deficits, and so on. And then all of a sudden, on the day that this finance bill was going to be voted in parliament, the people came out on the streets in a more or less spontaneous manner, led by the youth. But obviously Kenya's population is very youthful in general. But the youth came out on the streets, and they were not just picketing or petitioning the parliamentarians. No, they stormed through the gates of the parliamentary building. The members of parliament had to seek refuge in some tower next to the building. And so basically they physically prevented the passing of this finance bill. This is what an insurrection means, that when the masses are not just following the normal parliamentary or democratic procedures, but they take direct action to affect their will. And they managed to win a partial victory for a period of time, because then obviously later on the finance bill was passed in another different form. But I think that was very significant for two reasons. One, because of the question of debt. And remember that the question of debt was also the thing that brought down the Sri Lankan government, and also as a result of an insurrection. And number two, the role of the youth, which I think is now crucial. There's a whole generation of young people. Anyone who's today 30 or under 30, 35, they've basically been brought up all their conscious life under the crisis of capitalism.
I can confirm.
Started in 2008.
Yeah.
And they've been radicalized by all these things: wars, revolutions, insurrections, crises. There's no hope for this generation. Their living conditions are going to be worse than the previous generation.
Yeah.
And this has an impact across the whole of the world's political situation. And then we had the Bangladesh revolution. I think it can only be described as a revolution. It also started with the youth. This was in July. There was a movement of the youth against the quota system that reserves a number of jobs in the civil service for those who the relatives of those who participated in the National Liberation War in 1971. But in reality, it's a mechanism for cronyism for the ruling party, the Awami League. Anyway, there was a protest against this. The protest started as a student protest. And at the beginning, it wasn't even a very big protest, but the protest started to grow. And it clearly reflected a more deep-seated discontent with the economic situation, the repressive nature of the Hasina regime. And then the regime resorted to repression, brutal repression. They banned the student demonstrations. They used the rapid intervention force against the students, the border guard. They attacked the students. They used the thugs and the hooligans of the Awami League, the student league of the ruling party, to physically attack the students. And then there was a complete shutdown of communications, a curfew. Shutdown of the internet, and they thought that through repression they could stop the movement. But as many times happened, repression had the opposite effect, and the effect was to spread the movement. And then it has to be said that the student leaders acted in a very sharp and bold manner, and they called for the people in general to come out. And they had like a call for a national demonstration or national march on the capital, for people to stop work, for work stoppages, for the formation of committees in the neighborhoods and so on. And basically what you had was a massive uprising, repression, which led to hundreds, possibly thousands of people being killed, did not stop the movement. And in a matter of the peak of the movement was just over the weekend. By Sunday, the regime had been Hasina had been forced to flee the country, and the regime had completely collapsed. And I think that there's two main lessons, or maybe three main lessons to draw from this. One, the role that the youth played, in this case, the students at the forefront of this movement. Number two, the power of the masses. When the masses organize and they are decided to go ahead, there's nothing that can stop them. The Hasina regime was an extremely reactionary, repressive regime, was not able to stop the movement. But number three, the final lesson, which I think is maybe more significant and more long-lasting, is that once the students had overthrown the old regime, what happened? There was a transition government, which was installed by the army. The army intervened so that everything will change, so that nothing will change. And a new president was installed in Mohamed Yunus, who is an economist, Nobel Prize for economics, and he's basically a capitalist. So a capitalist government was put in place to replace the old capitalist government, with the addition of a couple of student leaders as ministers, just to give this new government legitimacy. But basically, nothing fundamental has changed.
It reminds me very much of what happened after the first phase of the Sudanese revolution, where the organizations that led that revolution, the professional organizations, these sort of white-collar revolutionary bodies, which played a very courageous role, you ended up in a transitional military council where you had the same blood-stained criminals who had been repressing the movement brought on as part of this transitional regime.
And they had a liberal, Mohamed Hamdouk, as their figurehead.
Precisely. He was a UN rapporteur, I believe.
Something like that.
Yeah,
in the case of Bangladesh, the interesting thing is that this movement, i.e. the overthrow of the old regime, has given confidence to the working class. And the workers in the big garment factories, in the call centers, they all work for imperialist companies. They now demanding their own rights, higher wages, trade union rights, and so on. And there's now a conflict between the new government and the police force and so on, and the bosses on the one side and the workers on the other side. And this has even led to deaths, repression, and so on. And this is maybe the most interesting phase of the movement, where when people start to realize, that they have achieved a victory, but nothing has fundamentally changed. The same old regime is still in place. The same bosses of the big garment companies are still in place, dominated, working for multinational companies, and basically nothing fundamental has changed. And therefore, it's not just enough to change the political facade or the political system. What is required is a revolutionary change the ownership that puts forward the question of the ownership of the means of production.
Yeah, it feels like a good demonstration of the permanent revolution in action. The inability, in the absence of the working class moving to the tasks of socialist reconstruction, completely pulling down the old regime, breaking up the old economic system, the old state, and building society anew. The inability to even consolidate the democratic tasks or the democratic victories that have been won as a result of this revolution. If comrades missed it, who are watching and listening, we did a whole episode on the permanent revolution a couple of episodes ago.
I will add that I recommend everyone to read Will Collins' article about the 1971 revolution in Bangladesh, the National Liberation War, which is a very good article, and about events which were revolutionary events, which are not generally well known. The article was published on Marxist.com, and it's recommended reading.
I'll second that, but also add Will's speech at the Revolution Festival a couple of weeks ago, which I believe is already on the YouTube channel of the Revolutionary Communist Party, the British section of the RCI. It's a really excellent speech, and I recommend that you give that a watch so you have more information about the background of this movement. I'm going to move on to something that we've alluded to a couple of times over the course of this discussion, which is the crisis of the regime. 2024 was described as it began as a year of elections. There was an unprecedented number of elections over the course of the year. But there were also a series of governments that simply collapsed. And this is concurrent with points we've made a few times in articles and in podcasts about the critically low levels of support and trust in the institutions of capitalism, in the courts, in the press, in the political system, even in things like the church, in the police. All of these institutions, the public support for them and trust in them has been utterly eroded by the crisis. Hamid, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about this, and specifically the election of Donald Trump, which again, we've done a whole episode on, we've talked about a number of times, but I feel like Trump's re-election is a real flashpoint in capturing and expressing this anger towards the status quo, albeit in a distorted way.
I mean, I have to say, when I can't remember if we discussed this on the podcast, Jorge, but when I read the bourgeois media, I get furious, and I can imagine a lot of working class people get very furious. There's an article I read, I think it was the day after the election in the US, by the US editor of the Financial Times. His name is Edward Luce. He's a particularly horrible specimen of this liberal type who dominate the traditional media landscape. And basically his article said, you know what the American people knew what they were going in for. It's not like they didn't know who Donald Trump was. They tried him before. They know he's a misogynist and a racist and a this and a that. And basically, you've ruined the country, and you did it on purpose. And now it's all on you. And then at the end of it, he said something along the lines of, they preferred that than the status quo. And I think...
Well, yes, they do.
And I think that really sums it up.
How bad the status quo is.
I think that sums it up. And then he goes on, and he's such a smug, arrogant bastard. He just really sums up that liberal voice.
A quote that I do have to hand actually comes from The Simpsons, where Seymour Skinner says, "Am I out of touch? No, it's the children that are wrong," which I think kind of captures the attitude of these sort of liberal media pundits. It's like, are we out of touch? No, it's the American people who are wrong.
Yeah.
They're too foolish and too racist and too ignorant to be trusted to make democratic decisions.
Precisely. And but the point is precisely, what's that status quo? What is that status quo? That is, more than 70% of Americans who were asked as they were voting said that they're angry. They're angry. That's what Americans are. Edward Luce and other guys like Gideon Rahman, again, one of the opinion columnists, I think he's the
FT, right?
FT,
the
editor
FT.
for the main editor or the economics editor. Following him on Twitter is just horrible, because all he talks about is how stupid people are, that they can't see that the economy is going so well. What are they talking about? The economy is going bad. We're not in a crisis. All the figures show that the wages have been going up, when in reality, people know that that's a lie. That's a lie. There's been wage stagnation over 40 years, but I'm sure, in fact, that if you actually go in and look at what people can afford today compared to what they could afford 5 or 10 years ago, it's not stagnation. It's a decline. The idea of getting a house, the American dream was you own your own house. You own a little house. You don't own much. You own a little house. You own 1 or 2 cars. You have 2 or 3 kids. One of you works.
You send your kids to university.
You send your kids to university. Where is that now? It's impossible. And we've talked about the American dream in the podcast as well. That has become a nightmare. There was one person who was quoted saying, "I feel like someone has been sitting on my chest for 4 years." That's the feeling of the American people. That's the status quo for them. And that's what they rejected. They rejected not just the Democrats. They rejected the whole establishment. They also rejected the Republicans. Remember that Donald Trump is not a Republican. Donald Trump is Donald Trump. It's the Trump party.
Yeah.
And he's taken over the Republican Party.
Yeah, he condemns the rest as rhinos, Republicans in name
And the
only,
ones
right?
who lined up against him were the Cheneys, the Bushes, the Clintons. There was the whole establishment. So that's what people are feeling. That someone is sitting on their chest. That's what they've been feeling for all of these years. It's been getting worse. And Trump was not even the beginning of it. It was there before Trump, before Biden. And there's a whole process of radicalization that's been taking place under the immense pressure that capitalism is putting on the American working class.
Yeah.
And then you have these guys like Edward Luce and all of their friends, all high and holy, that they're defenders of democracy and so on and so forth. They're the ones who've been supporting the war in Gaza. They're the one who've been destroying Ukraine. They've been, for all you can say, you can say everything you want to say about Trump. Trump did not start any wars.
No.
Biden started one war, has been supporting another, and these guys have been having a go at the whole world for years and years and years. They have so much blood on their hand, and that's the status quo that's been rejected by the Americans, and the liberals are covering for that. Are trying to put a
In fact, one of the most significant figures of this election, yes, Trump increased his vote by, but was it 2 or 3 million, which is significant because the whole establishment was against him, the whole of the media against him.
Yeah. Court cases thrown against him over the course of the last several years.
They tried everything to stop him, but he increased his vote by a little bit, maybe 2 million additional votes. But Harris lost, what is it, 7 or 8 million votes in relation to the 2020 vote for Biden. So it's the Democrats that really collapsed. And why did they collapse? Because of the economy, but also because of the genocidal war in Gaza that they fully involved and so on.
Yeah.
And because of all the people can see through them.
Yeah.
They act there like they are the defenders. Again, democracy. It's all talk about democracy. But as Jorge was saying before, all of these arguments are against democracy. They're saying people cannot be trusted
to
vote and to decide their own future.
Well, it's funny that you should say that because there's a big political crisis underway right now in France, and this comes off the back of Emmanuel Macron, who for a long time was held up as the great white hope of the liberal capitalist establishment. Yeah. He was, the sensible grown up in the room with all this populism of the left and the right. And in the last couple of years, he's used emergency presidential powers to ram through a hated pensions bill, which is an attack on pensions, actually. And more recently, he appointed as Prime Minister Michel Barnier, who came from the party that came fourth, I think, in the most recent
7% of the vote.
In the most recent elections, refused the left bloc won, the New Popular Front, the biggest part of which is France Insoumise, the left party. The convention is that the president picks a prime minister from the biggest party, completely refused, and picked the guy from the traditional centre-right. And now there's been a no-confidence vote against Barnier, and that administration has fallen. Macron says that he's going to fight on until the next elections regardless. So it was completely run roughshod over all the democratic conventions of the French Republic. And moreover, when there were big protests against the pension hike, which again was forced through undemocratically by decree, big protests, big strikes, they were brutally put down by the police, by the gendarmes. People were beaten up, were arrested en masse, were tear gassed. And you had before that the Gilets jaunes movement, which was similarly this big mass insurrection, broad layers of French society. It was triggered by an unpopular hiked fuel taxes, actually, but it spiraled into this massive movement, and that was viciously put down. So the French people, in a developed Western democracy, are being told, your votes don't matter, and if you protest, then we'll beat you up and arrest you. So there's actually no way of expressing your opinion.
In fact, there was it the Financial Times? They also had an article. It says the problem is that the French voters, they keep voting for lunatic options that are out of touch with reality.
Try again.
For the wrong people.
So again, the problem is the voters. This is an argument against democracy because the problem they have is the measures that they have to introduce in order to address the serious crisis of French capitalism are so brutal. They're talking now, this budget that was not passed included 60 billion euros worth of cuts and tax hikes on the working class. There's no party that's able to approve that. If any party that votes for that budget will lose the elections at the next election, and then they will be left with no parties to rule. That is the main problem. There's now a contradiction between the crisis of capitalism and the measures that the ruling class needs, and what and the will of the majority.
The strength of the working class.
Yes.
The working class has never been as big as it is now. In potential, it's never been as powerful as it is now. And there's no government which dares take them on. It's quite interesting because you see this very strange situation that, this potential strength of the working class also is not being reflected on the left.
Yes.
The left is completely capitulated to the system. You see,
It's weak and cowardly.
It's weak and cowardly. In the US, they all line up behind the Democrats, behind the establishment, behind the ruling class, which gives Trump an opportunity to portray himself as an anti-establishment figure. And but at the same time, the attacks that are necessary to be carried out, but cannot be carried out. Cannot be carried out. So you have this very strange situations developing where, on the one hand, the system goes into a crisis, and then you have these right-wing parties adopting widespread working class rhetoric, and even maybe even politics. I don't know, but rising up on the basis of working class anger and raising slogans, class slogans.
Well, this is a point that Antonio from a few weeks ago on Spectre of Communism, from the Revolutionary Communists of America, Bernie Sanders could have utilized this class anger, which is what lies behind Trump's election.
Yes.
We should be crystal clear about that. You've got Ivy League establishment figures backed up by billionaire pop stars telling you should be happy with the state of the world, where you can't afford your groceries, to send your kids to school, to heat your home, risking World War III, funding genocide abroad. Trump taps into that precisely because the left abandoned the field. Precisely because they weren't willing to capitalize on that rejection of the status quo, the right benefits.
In France, it's slightly different because the left is stood its ground a little bit more, let's say. Mélenchon is in opposition to all this. But even in the elections in July, Mélenchon made a pact, a non-written pact with Macron, so that they will withdraw some candidates in favor of Socialist Party candidates and in favor of Macron candidates, with the argument of stopping the far right. But in any case, let's say that in France, the left has stood its ground a little bit more and is now the biggest parliamentary bloc and is seen as opposing all these measures. The problem, I will say, with the left in France is that it concentrates all its efforts in parliamentary arithmetics and parliamentary maneuvers, when in reality, the only way to break the deadlock is through mass action on the streets, through the action of the workers, through all-out general strikes, and by posing the question of who rules the country. These people who don't even have a parliamentary majority or the interest of the majority of working people.
And the workers are ready for that.
And if this is not resolved in that way, then the people who will benefit is the far right of Le Pen.
I can't remember who said it. It might have been Lenin in relation to the provisional governments in Russia after the fall of the Tsar. He said something like, it's only through the support from the reformists that the government survives, the capitalism survives. And France is case in point of this. The French people have shown such willingness to take the fight to its conclusion. I mentioned the Gilets Jaunes movement. That was followed immediately by this massive series of general strikes, with the railways, the workers on the railways being the kind of heavy battalions, but also other layers. You had doctors and teachers and nurses and dock workers. And what happened? The leaders of the big trade union confederations basically drove those movements into a blind alley. They refused to let the French people use their strength to bring down Macron. Instead, they tried to use the movement to let off steam, to release some of the tension in society, and as a bargaining chip to try and extract some concessions through Macron's goodwill, I suppose.
Yeah, they followed a tactic which hasn't worked, which is the tactic of big days of action, isolated strikes. That is a method that has diminishing returns, because people say, okay, we've come out for 1 day, we've come out for 1 day, we've come out for 1 day every week, and nothing's changed. So in reality, what is needed is a strategy for a growing spreading all-out general strike. The interesting thing about France is that as a result of these events, within the CGT, which is the main trade union confederation, a left-wing opposition has emerged, led by the Chemical and Energy Workers Federation and the regional federation around the Marseille area. They call themselves Unité CGT, CGT Unity, and they have challenged the leadership. They said, these tactics don't work. What we need is a strategy for an all-out strike. And they have also said, in the face of this bloodbath of job losses, tens of thousands of job losses have been announced just in the month of October, November. They said what we need is the nationalization and the workers' control of all these industries. This is the correct way forward.
Yes.
And if this is translated from words into action, then we will see a big explosion of the class struggle in France.
I'm going to move on to some other places where major crises of the regime have expressed themselves in the last few weeks. Germany, the political and economic heart of Europe, formerly one of the most stable regimes in the whole world.
Yes.
The government collapsed. The government of Olaf Scholz. You've also seen this attempted coup by the president of South Korea. It was a bit of a farce in the end. It lasted for all of 20 hours or something, and it was brought down by a mass mobilization of the people of Seoul, but nevertheless shows the depth of the crisis of that regime. In Romania, the courts basically overruled an election result they didn't like, and there's pressure from Western institutions, from the EU, on the government of Georgia as well, which similarly won elections, allegations that it was illegitimate, but no actual proof brought out. You see everywhere regimes collapsing, and also a complete internal discrediting of the capitalists' own democratic systems, often by their own institutions, as they desperately try to retain control.
Yes, I mean, I'm not sure they're collapsing, but they're severely undermined and they're very, very weak. And I think the main weakness is in the Western sphere of the world. Obviously, the crisis of capitalism hits all areas, and it's affecting. We see Syria, for example, that's not within Western sphere of influence. However, you see the crisis in Europe, you see the crisis in the US, the crisis in South Korea. I think there is an element of this ruling class and the establishment that have been ruling these countries for decades and decades and decades, being more and more undermined. It's the legitimacy being more and more undermined, and them trying to maintain power by any means, and thereby weakening themselves even more, right? They're all completely discredited. No one trusts any of them. No one trusts their media. And they've been so hollowed out from the inside that, you can have someone like Trump coming and then just giving it a little prick. Yeah. And then that's what happened.
Yeah,
no one came to the defense of the Democrats. No one came to the defense of the establishment.
It takes one kick to knock over a rotten house.
Precisely. And I think this South Korea thing is a continuation of that. South Korea is an important Asian ally of the Americans. I think it's the only place outside of the US where US Navy ships are serviced. This is very important. US Navy obviously is crucial, is absolutely crucial for the US world, military domination of the world. You have an extremely advanced economy, an extremely advanced industry. We talked about it, shipyards, auto manufacturing, chip manufacturing, very advanced society, very proletarianized, but also very exploited working class. Now, for years and years, they've been maintaining themselves on the basis of an economic boom that existed, but also on the basis of hostility towards the North. As far as I understand, I'm not familiar with South Korean politics. However, as far as I understand, one of the main triggers of this crisis is that the president is coming under pressure from other parties who are calling for a slightly milder approach to the North. What does that mean? That is undermining the whole political basis of the regime, because the regime in South Korea kind of has this idea. It's a little bit like Israel, you can say, an element of the same method they use.
The siege mentality.
There is an enemy. They've got nuclear bombs. They've got all of these things, and they're ready to kill us all. if you don't rally up behind us so we can protect you. That's how the ruling class.
I remember, sorry to interrupt, but
Yeah.
the way that the president framed it when he announced his
Martial
military
law.
coup
That was
Martial law.
precisely
was
that.
he said, in order to save a liberal democratic Korea, we
Yeah.
need military rule.
Precisely. Which is always what the liberals end up saying. And but this crisis is accelerating the decline of that, right? Because it's not just the president being undermined, but it's the whole idea that he represents. It's also being undermined along with him. And now they have a constitutional crisis because obviously everyone wants to impeach this guy, but impeachment carries penalty of the death penalty. Because it's treason what he carried out. And so that's the penalty for treason.
That's awkward, yeah.
And he doesn't want to step down because as soon as he steps down, he's going to.
In fairness, neither would I.
And they can't get enough votes in parliament to impeach him. Even if they could, they don't have enough Supreme Court justices active to carry it through. Which means that what's happening, he's staying in power. He's come out, he's apologized. He said he's sorry to the whole people. There have been a march of 1 million people, organized mainly by the trade unions, trying to bring him down.
The trade unions actually called for an all-out
general
strike.
General strike. Anger is rife. Everyone is disgusted by the whole establishment. And now, but what are the liberals doing? The liberals are just putting up one more impeachment motion every week on a weekly basis. Why? Because they want to save the legitimacy of the system. But this insistence of saving the legitimacy of the system is discrediting the system because it's coming up against what everyone knows is right. Right? And so what's on the one side you have what's right is the punishment of this person in an attempted reactionary coup, and the other side is the maintenance of the system, and so they see the whole liberal establishment lining up behind that. And that's going to be a big blow to American imperialism.
The situation in Romania is even more outrageous because what you had is the first round of the election. This outsider, right-wing demagogue, won by surprise, to everyone's surprise. His name is Georgescu, and he won the first round of the election. The Social Democratic Party, just tradition is always made it into the second round, came third, was unable to this is the party of the Prime Minister. The party of the President, the National Liberal Party, of the serving President, came fourth or fifth, something like this. And so was completely out. And this Georgescu guy won. On what basis did he win? Of a campaign against NATO, against the war in Ukraine, against the European Union, and saying things basically like, why are we spending money in this war in Ukraine when the people at home don't have enough to eat? People in Romania have to emigrate to look for jobs. And now they're saying that the reason why he won is because he was using TikTok. But surely the reason is not TikTok. The reason is that his message resonated with people. Yeah. You can use TikTok as much as you want, but unless your message connects with the anger of the people, you're not going to come first in the first round of the election. Now, second round of the elections was coming up. The election was supposed to be last Sunday. And he was ahead in all the opinion polls. In one that I saw, he was getting 60% of the vote against the other candidate, another liberal candidate, but not from the traditional parties. Imagine the discrediting of the traditional parties. She was getting about 30%. So now the Supreme Court has decided to cancel the first round. And then the Guardian,
they didn't elect the right guy. So
that's right.
They need to try again.
The Guardian, which is the liberal newspaper, had an editorial about this, and they argued that it was right for the court to cancel the elections on the grounds of Russian interference. So this is the liberals, the Democrats. They're saying, yeah, you can have democracy, but if you elect the wrong guy because you're stupid and you believe some TikTok videos, then you can't have it.
I'm going to move on, but I want to put a capstone on this discussion about the crisis of the regime and the discrediting of bourgeois democracy with a quote from the great Marxist poet and playwright Bertolt Brecht. He writes, some party hack decreed that the people had lost the government's confidence and could only regain it with redoubled effort. If that is the case, would it not be simpler if the government simply dissolved the people and elected another?
Yes,
That sums it up.
He was talking about Stalinism, but it really fits the current situation
Yes.
and the capitalism.
In fact, everything that they say about Stalinism
They actually do.
is actually quite true today.
Yes. So basically, what's happening now is that bourgeois democracy is always the dictatorship of capital. But in normal times, it appears to be democratic.
Yes.
But now, the real nature of bourgeois democracy has been revealed for millions to see.
Yeah.
You can choose whoever you want, as long as the right guy that we want to carry out austerity measures. If you choose someone else,
Yes.
that's the end of it.
Well, talking about the reality of so-called bourgeois democracy, I'm going to return to the Middle East, with which we began this discussion, because obviously Gaza has been the flashpoint, but it hasn't stopped there. The entire region is a powder keg, and large sections of it are literally on fire. Netanyahu, in order to protract the fighting, because, as you mentioned, his political future depends in large part on the continuation of the war, also invaded Lebanon. And now you've seen the fall of the Assad regime in Syria following a lightning offensive by Islamist forces led by HTS, backed up by Turkey and others. What does all of this signify? What can we say about all this chaos and crisis in the Middle East?
Well, I think in terms of Syria, there's a lot to be said, because on the one hand, it reflects the instability on a world scale, the contradictions between the world powers, the breaking up of, on the one hand, of the old post-Soviet order with one world superpower. Now that you have competing powers, Russia and China in particular, on a world scale, you have more regional powers which are playing a more independent role. Countries like Turkey and Iran, even country like Israel, which is closely allied to the US, playing its own game which often goes against the interests of the American ruling class, and sometimes dragging America along with it. That's on the one hand, and I think we've dealt quite a lot with it. But I think what's actually important and interesting from what we just discussed is that what happened in Syria is also a reflection of what's happening underneath the surface of society and on the bottom amongst the working class and amongst the poor. Because here you have a country, the collapse of the Syrian army is a riddle that has to be solved in a way. Is a question we need to understand. How can it be that this same HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is a Islamist organization that's existed for 15, 16 years, it was nurtured and brought up essentially on the milk of CIA and the West. A CIA program of $500 million, one of the biggest ones in modern times.
1 billion.
1 billion.
They spent in the end.
Yeah. The only one I think that exceeds that is the dollar jihad that they had in Afghanistan, which I think where they had $1 billion per year or so. Anyway, let's not dwell on that. It was a CIA operation. They brought up this group, and they fought against the Assad regime for all of these years. The 8 years of civil war, they fought. They're quite good militarily. They're quite good fighters. In fact, they were the best trained, but most disciplined,
well
fighters.
equipped as well. It looks to me
Quite well equipped, because obviously they have access to Western arms and now Turkish arms. The point is not that. The point is, how come they didn't succeed in those years? How come it took them years and years of fighting over Aleppo, and they lost, and yet this time around they took Aleppo in 3 days? You see, the Islamists in Syria during the Syrian Revolution never had backing in the major cities. On the West in particular, Aleppo, Damascus, Latakia, all of the industrial areas, for the most part, were pro-regime. The Islamists had a support mainly in rural areas. Not entirely, but mainly in the rural areas. And in the Aleppo city, they never had a foothold. That's why it was so difficult for them to gain that city, and they lost it after years of fighting. But that is what's changed. Not in the sense that people in Aleppo support these people, these gangsters, but that the regime has lost its support. Back then, the majority of Syrians, most of whom were probably critical dissatisfied with the regime, they nevertheless rallied behind the regime because they saw it with the onslaught of a Islamist, horde. They would rather have a stable Assad regime, the guarantee of a higher living standards, more stability. But now, all of these years after the war, the economy is in shatters. There's loss of sanctions. There's complete dislocation of the economy. I think during the war alone, the economy collapsed by 60%. And since then, it's only gone further down. American and Western sanctions have pushed it even further down. But on top of that, what you have in Syria, even though they won against US imperialism, you can say in a way, was not a socialist regime, was not a socialist government. It was a capitalist government, which carried out capitalist policies in the benefit of the capitalist class and its allies, which were Iran and Russia. And they were seen as what? As propping up that capitalist class, who was extremely corrupt. And I would say the blows to the Syrian economy that the Western sanctions gave it actually exacerbated that situation. Why? There's no profitable investments to be made in Syria, or very few. So what does the capitalist class do? It becomes more and more just parasitic, stealing, robbing, racketeering. That's what essentially is going on. That's what the Assad regime has become. And it has a wide network of prisons, thousands of people sitting in prisons. Apparently, some people were released the other day. This was one of our comrades was telling me that who didn't know that Hafiz al-Assad was dead. i.e. Bashar al-Assad's dad. They've been there for decades. Brutal regime. And so people are looking back over the civil war and they're thinking, what did we fight for? What did we get out of this? And in the end, again, I'm quoting one of our comrades. He said he's Syrian and he's in touch with people, activists on all sides of Syrian society. And he said, in the end, people were desperate and no one wanted to defend this regime. And I think there's a red thread here between what we've been talking about in a way, is that you can say there's an element of class anger here, but which didn't find an outlet. It didn't have find a revolutionary outlet. And then you have an accidental group coming and just kind of flicking at the regime, and the whole thing collapsed, right? It's not so much that the Islamists gained support, but it was that the anger and dissatisfaction and demoralization with the regime and with the general way of Syrian capitalism was working was so high that no one wanted to come to its defense. And that's, in my opinion, a sign of the times. And throughout we've been saying this all over the Middle East. Yes, class anger. It reflects itself in different ways. But the masses are angry, they're hungry, they're under pressure, they're feeling that someone is sitting on their chest and it's only getting worse. But that is not yet finding a revolutionary outlet. That's if there's anything that's the red thread of this year from a class point of view, it's that. And therefore, obviously, we're going to see this process continuing. The class struggle is going to continue. These guys are not going to solve anything either in Syria or anywhere else for that matter. As long as there's one wing of the capitalist class or another that comes to power, whether it's Trump or these Islamists, or if it's the Democrats, none of them can solve the actual problems that people have because they are rooted in the system as a whole. And therefore, we're going to see we're entering, as we can see, a period of extreme instability, revolution, wars, revolution, and counter-revolution, which I think has been more or less the topic of today's show.
So, I think that we've drawn together a lot of the threads, but there's one thing that we haven't talked about yet. We often say that the main problem in terms of the continuation of capitalism, the lack of any sustained and victorious struggle against this rotten system, is the absence of the subjective factor. It's the absence of revolutionary leadership. And obviously, the RCI is a long way from being the world party of communism that the working class desperately needs, but we have taken some big strides forward this year. We founded the RCI, previously the International Marxist Tendency, had a founding conference in the spring, one of the most inspiring events I've ever attended, probably the most inspiring event I've ever attended. We've launched new parties all over the world, and we've really begun to make a name for ourselves. Hamid, I know you've brought a few facts and figures about the steps we've taken this year.
Well, yes. First of all, I would say the launch of the Revolutionary Communist International itself, I think, was an important event. We actually had this as a hybrid event, i.e., people could follow it live on online. There were not only the launch, there were a whole week of discussions about Marxist theory, about the approach of of communists towards different topics. I think everyone should go and re-watch or listen to those things. There's a podcast. It's also on Spotify. It's on YouTube.
School of Communism. I'll link it in the description of the episode.
School of Communism. I've met quite a lot of people who've joined us since then, who go back and listen to all of the talks and say how much they get out of it. But that event, I think, was really historic in many ways. And just to give the numbers, we had 7,800 people signing up to watch that event. That doesn't mean that they all watched them, but this is a significant amount of people who were inspired by what? By the launch of an international revolutionary party, in essence, communist party, in essence, which is what we are. Now that tells you something. This is not the time of COVID where everyone is online doing things on Zoom. That people sign up for an online meeting is a huge thing. And I think we've seen from the figures that thousands of people have been watching. In some of the videos, the launch video, I think, had more than 8,000 views as it was launched. People signed up from more than 120 countries. This means that there's a significant layer of workers and youth who are drawing very radical conclusions on the basis of the events that we've been talking about. That they're looking for a radical way out, and they're beginning to see communism as the only solution. We have now in the RCI official sections in 26 countries. We have groups. I've written in 12 countries, but I think actually it's more like 14 or 15 countries. We have established groups who are carrying out regular work and working towards becoming sections. And then we have more work, contacts, and people who are trying to establish groups, so to say, in, basically activities in a total of more than 70 countries all over the world. And I think this is a significant achievement, which has been based on years and years of building the forces of Marxism, the forces of communism, on the basis of recruiting and educating people on the basis of ideas, having discussions like we have now, trying to understand, not just go out there and shout, we are communists, we are revolutionists, but actually trying to understand what are the general process driving the crisis of the system, what are the tasks of the working class, and what are the tasks of the communists in that response. And I think the results has been great. As you say, we've launched revolutionary communist parties in Britain, in the US. Our American Comrades launch video was seen by hundreds of millions of people.
Shared by the likes of Elon Musk and Jordan Peterson.
Yes.
I don't think that they were terribly impressed with our comrades' work, but we'll take the advertising all the same.
We launched Revolutionary Communist Party in Canada, Britain, Italy, France, Germany, all over Europe.
Pakistan.
Last weekend we did. People can see the report on our website. And I think the main question we should ask is, what is our justification? What is our justification? And I think the discussion we've had here really shows it, because what you have is a system, first of all, a system in a deep crisis. For years and years, you had a situation, especially in the West, where the ruling class, because of the beneficial economic situation, could give certain concessions, create a relatively stable living standard, and thereby could give the idea, could promulgate the idea that capitalism makes life better, and it gets better one day. One day is better than the previous, and so on and so forth. Tomorrow is going to be better than yesterday, and that's going to continue. If we all work hard, if we all stick to our democratic rules and regulations, if we all stick to, abiding and listening to the men in suit and the mass media, and just go about our days fitting within the system, everything will be okay, and we're all going to be fine. Now, that system, that narrative, you can say, speaking of narrative, is coming crashing against reality, because the system is going into a crisis and everything is falling apart. wars, poverty, misery, climate disasters, the corruption. It's just mess at every level. And what you have is the old, Marx says all that is solid melts into air. The old ideas don't correspond to reality. And people are beginning to rethink. And there's a process of change in the consciousness, of actually where people are realizing, wait a minute, we're not all in the same boat. We're not all one nation or one world or one West. There's a difference not between me and the guy next door from the other country. There's a difference between me and the guys and my boss. Us and the rich is us and them. And that class consciousness is developing. But that's still in an incipient phase. That's still in a, like we see in the US, is still in a form of a rejection more than anything, rather than a real understanding of what is our program then, what is our true class interest. And that's where communists come into play, because communism bases itself on the study of history, on a scientific understanding of what is necessary, what is at the basis of the crisis of this system, and how can we get out of it? By the working class leading a revolution and coming to power, taking over the means of production and planning them according to the democratically planning them according to the needs of society. Now we have that full program on the basis of studying history, studying the class struggles, studying the economics and the machinery of the system, the dynamics of the system. But the working class itself is coming to that conclusion through its own experiences, step by step, through painful experiences, through big events, like everything that we're seeing in front of us. Our task is to help that process along, help that process reach its final conclusion, i.e. with the taking of the power of the working class. And the bigger we are, the bigger an influence we can have in the development of that consciousness. And that is what the justification for the RCI is. That's what we're building.
There are plenty of examples of the kind of activity that our comrades all around the world have been doing that illustrate the way that we're trying to capitalize on the mood that Hamid's describing, and that our ideas are beginning to connect with, still for the moment, a minority, but still a growing minority. Jorge, I know that you were fortunate enough to vote for a revolutionary communist candidate at the most recent general elections in Britain. And I wanted to end by reflecting on the experience of one of our comrades, one of our leading comrades in Britain, Fiona. She had an absolute bombshell interview on GB News where she skewered Suella Braverman, who's one of the most noxious Tory MPs. She's one of the most famous and important right-wing Tory MPs, former Home Secretary, absolutely demolished her over the question of British support for Israel's war in Gaza. It went massively viral, and she presented herself openly as a revolutionary communist, criticising imperialism, criticising British capitalism, from someone who was active in the aftermath of that interview and Fiona's election campaign, because off the back of that she ran as a parliamentary candidate in Stratford and Bow in East London. What would you say came out of that experience in terms of the mood of the people who were drawn in?
Yes, this is very interesting, actually. There is a lot of competition for the title of the most obnoxious Tory leading figure, but Suella Braverman is up there. And yes, I think that the most significant thing of this is perhaps two things. One is that how much that interview resonated with a lot of people. The interview was not given for the audience of GB News, with mostly reactionary people, but it went viral outside of it. Why? Because for the first time, or for one time, people could see someone really telling the truth, telling what they thought. You are a liar, and what's happening in Gaza is a genocide, which everyone knows, or a lot of people have come to realize, But at the same time, all the establishment parties, Labour and the Conservatives, are saying the opposite.
Yes.
It's not a genocide, it's legitimate self-defense. And all the media is telling us that this is legitimate self-defense. And if you criticize that, you are an anti-Semite. So for the first time, there was a voice that clearly articulated the mood, the feeling of millions of people who've been demonstrating in the hundreds of thousands and protesting and being angry at the images coming out of Gaza. I think that is very significant, because this is not what you usually get from the left or the official left. The left is as we said before, cowardly, meek, apologizing.
Yeah.
Oh yes, no, but no. And here was Fiona Lally from the Revolutionary Communist Party saying things as they are. This is, I think, what resonated and continues to resonate. Even to this day, we get people in a paper sale or people who contact us and says, oh, you are the party of Fiona Lally who spoke the truth.
Yes.
And this, I think, was very significant. And during the election campaign, we also saw a lot of that. The election campaign was fought mainly on the issue of Palestine, but linking the issue of Palestine with home politics, i.e. the same people who are justifying the genocide in Palestine are the same people who are telling you there's no money for healthcare, there's no money for education, and so on. And so hence this slogan, books, not bombs, healthcare, not warfare. And I think that this resonated with a wide layer of people who are thinking this. Of course, it's one thing for people to sympathize with these ideas. It's a different thing to maybe then translate it into votes. Our vote was very respectable. We think it's a very good result. But nevertheless, I think that the message resonated even with a wider layer of people. And we have to say, this was a campaign that was run on a revolutionary communist program. We didn't hide our program. We didn't say we're just the pro-Palestine candidate. Yeah, we are the pro-Palestine candidate that says that the solution is socialism. The solution is the struggle to change the whole system. And I think very significantly, we also brought things home. This is not just about solidarity with the people of Palestine, which it is, but it's also about saying those responsible are our own ruling class at home.
Yes.
And we need to fight them at home and abroad. I think that this is very significant. And this message resonates with many. There are many people who are eager and waiting for someone to say those things.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I would also add, Fiona's campaign had a huge impact. Many people I've seen join our organization. All of them have had a strong relation somehow, have been following Fiona, have been making sure that we're the same party as Fiona, or has come through seeing Fiona's campaign. But I will also say that, this is not an accident. The fact that we have a comrade that becomes so prominent is not an accidental event. In fact, what we do is to educate people in order to become leaders, in order to be able to size up a situation in the class struggle and intervene in different situations, in different ways. Some of them on a public platform, such as Fiona, others in workplaces, in schools, where they are on the streets. And there's the other side of the real work of the RCI in reality is precisely that, the building of cadres, of revolutionary communist cadres on the ground in a systematic way. And I just want to, if I can end with one thing, which is a couple of weeks ago, there was an expose, is that what you call it? Mm-hmm. In one of the main newspapers in Denmark.
Oh, yeah.
There was a chronicle, a center page or spread, a full page spread with a liberal, it's written by a liberal, by a real liberal who stands for liberal ideas and studies liberal theory. He decided to infiltrate our organization. Our organization in Denmark is now quite prominent or visible, let's put it like. Our posters are everywhere in the major cities. We have lots of branches. We have at least, I think, 20 or 21 branches all over the country, 15 in Copenhagen, the capital. So he decided to go visit one of our branch meetings. And he writes, with the idea
of ridiculing us.
Exactly. He said, let me be honest, I don't know what I expected. Perhaps a small collection of nostalgics in military uniforms who, longing for the greatness of the Soviet Union, dreams of reintroducing the 5-year plans. And then he said, or maybe a bunch of hippies around a campfire. At the very least, I would have expected a low level of tolerance due to my status as a self-proclaimed liberal and proud spreader of capitalist propaganda. I met neither. And then he goes on to explain how our branch meeting was held, which is our branches. We have hundreds and hundreds of branches all over the world that people can join on a weekly basis, become active in, and they always start with a political discussion. And he goes on to say that there was a presentation which was very well prepared, well articulated, took about half an hour, after which an almost 2-hour long debate followed among the other members. Everyone, even me as a heretic outsider, was allowed to express their opinion on this occasion. And then he says, the level and depth of the discussion would have been enough to take most people's breath away. Even relatively inexperienced attendees were able to recite and understand Marxist works and argue articulately from them. And he goes on to, in the end, he basically draws the conclusion that we have failed as liberals. I think, in fact, the title was, I infiltrated the Revolutionary Communist Party. What I found was a recipe for victory. That's what he writes. And he says, why can't we do this as liberals? We don't study our theory. Here you have the communists, even the newest communist members are encouraged to study theory and can articulate it well and discuss and argue and defend their ideas in front of ordinary working class people. And obviously, the point that the liberalism is declining is not because they can't articulate a theory. It's because the theory does not match up with the reality that people are.
They defend the indefensible. No problem.
And they defend exploitation, oppression, wars. All of the ills of capitalism.
I can imagine him reading that, going, "Oh no, oh no."
But the point is, that's what we're building. We're not just the RCI. We are becoming an established force on the left now. We have podcast. We have 2 podcasts internationally. We have lots of podcasts all over the world. We have, offices. We have full-timers, staff.
Theoretical
magazines. We have a daily website, themarxist.com. A bookshop, well-read books. We have all of these things, but not just in order to say, oh, we have them, but not just to shine, and not just, we have comrades now who are becoming public figures, such as Fiona, other comrades all over the world in different countries. We hear that in Denmark, for example, we are in the national news at least once a month, if not more, on TV, on radio. In Italy, we've been invited to participate in weekly debating programs on national TV. Everywhere, we're making an impact. But the real work of the organization, what it's all based on, is precisely what this liberal experience. The day-to-day systematic work in the schools, in the workplaces, in the neighborhoods of recruiting and educating revolutionary communists in order so that we can intervene once the class struggle develops. So that when you have a situation that like in the US with this mass ferment, but there's no one to lead it. But imagine what we could have with 5 or 10 or 20,000 American communists. If we could have that on all the major campuses, in all the major workplaces, in all the major cities, having branches, and then standing up and being large enough to be heard by those people, and having comrades in every one of these localities able to explain our ideas, explain our program, connect them with the everyday life of the working class. That is the recipe for victory. That's what we're building in a systematic way. We're not taking shortcuts, but that's what we're spending the majority of our energy on. And that's what we're recommending everyone, if you're listening to this podcast and others and are interested in our ideas, if you agree with our ideas, to join us, to come to a branch meeting anywhere you are and join the struggle.
Well, I can only end by commending our Danish comrades and educating their members so well, and on our liberal infiltrator for such a glowing review. And to second the last point that Hamid made, if you agree with what you've heard today, and if you want to acquire that recipe for victory, it lies in the ideas of Marxism. And the sole purpose of the Revolutionary Communist International is to educate its members, to build its cadres through teaching them the ideas of Marxism so that we can lay the basis for the revolutionary leadership that humanity desperately needs to put an end to capitalism, imperialism, exploitation, and lay the basis for a dignified and decent existence for our species. This was the final episode of both the Spectre of Communism podcast and Against the Stream this year, but don't worry, we will be returning in 2025 with a new series of discussions on a variety of topics. Hopefully it's apparent by now, but Spectre of Communism deals with deep dives on history and theory, and Against the Stream is rolling analysis of the most important events of the day.
And I just want to say that this episode, which is pre-recorded, will be the last episode of Against the Stream this year. We will be back again on Thursday, the 2nd of January. For all of those who follow us on a weekly basis, we'll be skipping 1 week and we'll be coming back on the 2nd of January.
Great. Spectre of Communism will probably return a little bit later, sometime in February, but in any event, I'll make sure that you are updated. So, I will end by thanking our guests, Hamid and Jorge.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I will say goodbye for now. Revolutionary season's greetings, and we will see you in 2025.
A spectre is haunting Europe. The spectre of communism.
Communism is stronger, more determined than ever.
Dedicated to the establishment of a new order.
Just what is communism?
I'll guarantee that 10 minutes from now, a lot of you are going to have a new understanding of communism.